Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's so nice to actually be in front of people. For me, it's the first time since almost 2 years ago, I think, where I spoke at a panel that wasn't just me talking to my dog who was lying on the couch across from my desk. So really nice to see everyone. And so, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this morning's plenary session, which explores ESG, responsible mining, and ensuring better wealth distribution. The title of the panel was about how can the mining industry work better with governments and local communities to this end. And I'm Louise Pearce, as Andrew introduced. I'm the Global Head of Mining at ERM. We are the world's leading pure-play sustainability consultancy, and we work with businesses from all sectors, actually, around the world, and specialize in operationalizing sustainability and ESG. And we call that our boots to boardroom approach, which means that we have the ability to operate and get things done at the C-suite, corporate, asset, and field levels with broad, deep capabilities. And so to join me today on the discussion is a great panel. Oh, thank you, Taiwo. We were looking for you before, so thank you for showing up. I'll start, in the order of it. And I'll start from my left. So Sylvia Tonova, she's a global disputes partner at Jones Day, and she focuses on the resolution of complex, high-stakes international disputes with a particular emphasis on disputes between foreign industries and governments. And next to Sylvia is Louise Rathel, and she's the head of investor relations at Central Asia Metals PLC. And a huge thanks to Sylvia, who stepped in for Gillian Davidson, who couldn't make it due to illness this morning. So huge thanks. Next to Louise is Ignacio del Calonje. He's the Chief Investment Officer for IFC for the Energy and Minerals Division, Metals Division. And so he's also a stand-in with a couple more days' notice for someone who didn't make it across the Atlantic, as is the case. And next to him is John Samuel. John Samuel is the group head of responsible business partnerships for Anglo American, and his role focuses on the ethical value chains and thriving community elements of Anglo American's sustainable mining plan, which is pretty neat. And I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing from John. And then to the far left, Taiwo. Nice to meet you, Taiwo. He was in person. He's the Senior Director of Investments at Africa Finance Corp. And he's a multilateral specialist infrastructure financing institution headquartered in Lagos, Nigeria. And he has the responsibility for the management and optimization of the investments in its core sectors, including oil and gas and mining. Great. So before I turn to the panel, who are going to do all the talking, let me just quickly set the scene. I think we can all agree the vital role that mining plays, providing the materials that are required for much of society's needs, including the transition to a low-carbon economy. And however, I think a key challenge for our sector is how it's perceived by those that sit within, across, and around the mining and metals ecosystem. And this is made more complex by the need to ensure a just transition to low-carbon energy. As such, all of our actions taken need to be much more collaborative, purposeful, and holistic in order to move beyond what we've had as a status quo for some time to create value for all. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Taiwo. And Taiwo, when you're making investments, particularly in Africa, how can we better leverage the mining projects and new mining investments to existing projects to support livelihoods and build secondary and tertiary industries? Yeah, and if I can ask the panel, if you have any specific examples as we go along, I think that's what folks would like to hear too. So.
Yeah, thank you, Louis, and good day, my fellow panelists and audience. Obviously, mining and commodities represent very important aspects of the economies of African countries. In many African countries, they completely dominate the economy. Therefore, what happens to mining, how sustainable we invest in mining, has significant implications for the livelihoods and the well-being of all Africans, of the African people. And therefore, the government, the mining concerns, and the communities have to work together to ensure that we undertake mining investments in the most sustainable manner. Basically, what we are talking about is the age-old concept of stakeholders and shareholders. We have to appreciate that for any mining investment, for any investment at all, we have stakeholders that go beyond the people that put direct money into such investments. And therefore, how do we balance the financial aspects, the social aspects, the environmental aspects, to ensure that for the mining concerns, for those who put their money in the investments, they can get the returns they need. But for the government, as well as for the communities, the mining operations also deliver tangible benefits. And therefore, we go through this in very different ways. And different companies have tried different approaches. And these are generally community engagements. We need to, mining companies have to understand that they are not an island on themselves. They operate within a community among people. And therefore, community engagement has to be a very important aspect of their operations. And from community engagement, then you go to community investing. And community investing is just an appreciation that for mining concerns, you will also have to create some avenues to provide some services to the communities in which you operate. And for the companies that have been successful are those that have done this in a very measured and strategic manner. That is, instead of having what I would call random facilities, maybe one school here, one health sector there, what many mining companies have been able to do is to actually enter into a memorandum of understanding with the community, whereby they are able to do a long-term plan with the community to say, over the next 10, 15 years, for example, this is what we will be able to do. One, it makes the investment more strategic and planned, but also, it also moderates the expectations of the community, because we have to understand that the mining concern is not supposed to be an alternative government for the community, and the resources are not infinite. So it's important that the expectations are managed, what is possible are clearly explained and accepted by the community. And we have done that in Nigeria. We have done that in some of the investments we have in Gabon, for example, in the manganese sector in Gabon, as well as in the bauxite sector in Guinea. So these are aspects that can work for mining companies. And the other thing is to ensure that mining companies also try to downsize their procurement so that they can also develop the economies around them by buying things from the community, foodstuffs, little things, and also providing some services for the communities as well. And last but not least, I would like to also talk about the small miners, the artisanal miners. The conventional old-time wisdom has been to try and discourage this, or sometimes just shut them down. But these days, I think many mining concerns have developed a win-win situation whereby they are borrowing from what has worked very well in the agriculture sector, for example, through the Outgrower program, whereby you can actually empower the artisanal miners and buy from them teach them how to do their business well, probably provide additional facilities for them, and then guarantee their product through purchase of the products. And that can be a win-win situation whereby you are doing your industrial scale mining, but you are also able to empower the small scale miners, and ultimately the country and the people will benefit. So it's going to be a combination. Not every part of this will be applicable to every single company. So it's going to be a combination of several or some of each of these approaches, but definitely sustainable mining, being responsible to the community, and ensuring that we are able to deliver tangible benefits to the community in which we operate, has to define how we conduct our operations going forward. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Taiwo. That's very interesting. And maybe I'm going to turn to Ignacio next, because also with the IFC, when you're doing investments. So can you tell us, how do we bring to the table what the investors are looking for in terms of mine development? And is this actually a change in value proposition for all stakeholders? And if you could give us some examples of some of the specific things that you're seeing that are exciting and look a little bit different than they might have done a few years ago.
Well, thanks, Louise. So hopefully the mic is working. No? Okay. All right, well, let's use this. So yes, things are evolving in terms of how we see mining and communities. So I think, as Taiwo says, it's important for the mining company to make an engagement with the communities and agree on long-term plans and seeing how they can impact those local communities in a tangible way. And one of the ways that we've traditionally looked at doing that is through local suppliers. And for example, in Guinea, we've invested in two major bauxite mines in Guinea over the last few years. And there, for example, we helped to put in place a marketplace for local suppliers, where we help train up local suppliers to be able to bid for contracts with the mines, trained up over 3,000 individuals, and about 1,800 local small enterprises and individuals were able to access that. And as a result, there were about $20 million in contracts that were awarded to very local suppliers to those mines. And I think that's fantastic. And obviously it's something we need to sort of continue to do. I think where we as IFC come in and where things have evolved is where can we help that is difficult for the mining companies to do something, right? And that's the interface between the mining company and the government and the broader sort of regional and national context, which is sometimes very challenging for mining companies to insert themselves there. So, for example, some of the things we've been doing in Peru, as most of you know, in Peru, local municipalities get a part of the royalties. And for many of those municipalities, it's challenging to actually decide and prioritize investments in those local communities. So in the Apurimac region in Peru, we put in place a program to help local municipalities to build their capacity to actually spend the money wisely of the Cañón Minero. And as a result, we were able to facilitate the deployment of $40 million of those royalties back into the communities for things that actually count, and not for 100,000 capacity football stadium, which was not necessary. So that's sort of one element, which again is difficult for the mining company to insert itself there. And us as the IFC, part of the World Bank Group, we feel we can bridge that. The other thing we're trying to do is reduce the suspicion of the local communities. So the traditional way is, your water is fine, we're telling you it's fine, we've done an ESIA, the government's telling you it's fine, they've controlled that, so what's the problem? I think that thinking has evolved, and what we've been trying to do is actually build the capacity of local communities to actually self-monitor themselves. So partnering with local universities, doing training courses for local communities, local NGOs on, for example, water quality and sampling of water, so that you say, well, look, you might not believe the government, you might not believe the mining company. Do it yourself. See for yourself how your water quality is evolving. So again, some tools that have evolved to create that increased trust with local communities. And the last thing I'll say, but I'll let John maybe touch on it, is how to collaborate with other partners in a what we're shared value type of platform, a regional context where we're partnering with people like Anglo, as we're doing in Moquegua in Peru, local NGOs, local government, to look at a regional development plan, and how can we think beyond just supplier finance, but at a broader regional development plan for that region. So those are just a few of the things that we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And then let's go to John next to hear more about what Anglo American's doing to change the outcomes for all the stakeholders in the regions. Because you are doing some great stuff, clearly.
Okay, thank you. Is my microphone on? Yep, great, thank you. So I think that there's a few things we're doing. I mean, I think firstly, one of the things we're trying to do is change the way we mine sometimes. We know there are aspects of mining that we wouldn't want in our back gardens, and other people shouldn't be expected to put up with that. So there's a big focus through things like technology to design mines in just much less impactful ways. So using less water, using less land, for example, and obviously climate's a big issue, so producing less carbon emissions as well. So that's a big part. It's not my area of expertise, but we're doing a lot on that. And you can see that, for example, in some of the new mines we're building, like the Woodsmith mine up here in North Yorkshire here in the UK, which when that mine is finished, you will be able to drive very close to that mine and not even know it's there, even though it's a bulk materials mine in a national park. So it'll be practically invisible unless you're flying over it. So I think there are things we can do on that front, but then a bit more sort of perhaps in the areas we're talking about here is, firstly, as Ignacio says, mines, and particularly big mines, are often they're a one-off opportunity for a region to significantly boost its development outcomes. And, we might see them as capital investment projects, but for governments, for communities, they're often regional development projects. And if you look at it from that lens, you start to think about some of the things you do very differently. And so we have a process called collaborative regional development, which we're rolling out at pretty much all our assets in the provinces where we operate, where we try and identify what is the untapped socioeconomic potential of those regions. So we will look at everything from soils and climate, infrastructure, skills, historical assets, natural heritage, you name it. We'll look at all the things that could support viable, long-term, sustainable job creation. And we mean sustainable both in terms of enduring and in terms of sustainability, of course. And we will try and find opportunities, and then we will partner with others. So as Ignacio mentioned, in Peru, we've done this work in Moquegua province where our Quellaveco copper project is nearing completion. And that works for us partly because people will look to the mine often, as Taiwo said, for jobs, but we don't actually employ huge numbers of people on modern mining operations. So how can we make sure there are lots of other job opportunities? And we typically find there are lots of untapped areas. So, agriculture is an obvious one in Moquegua, in Limpopo in South Africa, in Northern Cape in South Africa. We found lots of untapped agricultural opportunities that can be grown in those climates that don't need irrigation, for example. So they're very sort of sensitive to the local environment in that sense. But what we often find is that they're cash crops, and to make them viable, you need in-region processing. For in-region processing, you need the quality and volume of feedstock. So you've got this catch-22. So we can't solve that on our own, but if we partner with government, with other companies, as we are doing in both South Africa and in Peru and in Brazil and actually up in Yorkshire as well, if we partner with other people who've also got land or also got resources and skills, who know off-take partners, for example, that can actually start to create industries that are not just farming, for example, but you've got the packing, you've got the logistics, the processing, you've got the engineering around the processing. So you've got a whole value chain that you're creating alongside the mine that can create jobs. So that's, we see that as really important, and as a big investor in a region, we think that's in our long-term interest. It's always much easier to operate somewhere that's prosperous and stable than it is somewhere that's poor and and fractious. I think secondly, you touched on our sustainable mining plan. We've set ourselves some long-term targets for supporting socioeconomic development in host communities. So, for example, on supporting job creation in host communities, by 2030 we've set ourselves the target of creating 5 jobs off-site for every job on-site in all those countries where unemployment's relatively high. So we sort of use over 10% as a bit of a benchmark. So that applies to most of the countries we're operating in. And so we actually now have quite a big program to try and work out how do we sustainably support jobs in host communities. And it talks to what you were talking about, that long-term commitment. And as soon as you start setting out an objective, actually you start to think about problems very differently and how we would normally look at them in business. You know, how are we going to get to 5 off-site to 1 on-site? And we're taking it very seriously. It's in our executive long-term intensive plan, for example. If we don't deliver, it affects our bonuses. We're also looking at things like education, which is clearly critical. Mining is by definition finite, so the best thing we can leave behind is good infrastructure and good skills. I think we've been pretty good on the infrastructure side, but without skills it's not so valuable. So we want the schools in our host communities to be in the top 20% of the schools in the countries in which we operate, for example. And because we're in rural areas in developing countries very often, they're more likely to be in the bottom 20% than the top 20% at the moment. So again, how do you support a school system? And it's very important we're supporting the government school system. We're not going to start running loads of schools. We want to support government to do what they want to do better. So that's teacher training, it's infrastructure, it's ICT access, it's working with parents and students to help them learn. Many of these people, will have had parents who didn't have a formal education or much of a formal education. So the whole culture change there. And we're doing the same thing on health as well. And then I think the final thing is we're trying to be a lot more transparent about how we're operating across the piece, because I think it was mentioned on the previous panel that mining is one of the least well regarded and least trusted industry sectors in the world, which I think pains many of us who are closely involved in the sector and are proud to be involved in the sector. So we have committed, for example, that all of our assets will be assured against a recognised responsible mining standard. So for our De Beers diamond mines, that's Responsible Jewellery Council, which has been around for many years. We're looking at Coppermark. We're also looking at the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, which is a multi-stakeholder standard. It's a very tough, rigorous standard, and actually ERM's helping with the audits. And it's a tough process for our sites to go through. We don't always agree with some of the requirements in the standard, but that's a negotiation we will have with our stakeholders and try and educate them as to why we think maybe that's not the right standard, or maybe they'll educate us and we'll understand why that is important to them. And we hope that through that transparency and that accountability to a wider stakeholder group, that also builds trust and allows us to have some of the developmental dialogues which are really important.
Great, and thank you so much. Great examples. I'm going to turn to Sylvia now, because I think when you touched on it, and John, you said that we live in work in a less well-regarded sector at times, and I think that's true. So Sylvia, when things go wrong, what lessons can we learn from the various conflicts and disputes that you help with a lot, and why do you think that governments and communities are more empowered now, and how do we get out ahead of that so again we get to better outcomes for all?
Thanks, Louise. So my perspective is slightly different. Where I come out at it is that we can learn a lot about how mining can work better with governments and local communities from the instances when they have failed to do that for one reason or another. Perhaps when all of these wonderful initiatives that you just heard about maybe were either not tried, maybe were tried and failed, or maybe there was a sheer misunderstanding between the government and local communities and the investor. So my perspective is really from the angle of the dispute resolution process, right? From the instances where a foreign mining company, has to bring a claim against a government for a breach of international law, whether it's your old-fashioned expropriation or any other sort of unfair treatment. And I just give you a real example, because I think theoretical remarks really don't work in terms of just explaining what I do. But I think you all would have read last week that Hochschild mining in Peru made headlines, right? Because the Peruvian Prime Minister essentially declared over the weekend that they would be closing Hochschild's mines in Peru. And as a result of that, obviously, the value of that company on the London Stock Exchange plummeted. I think it lost about $300 million pounds in value. Obviously, the government, as I understand it, hadn't informed the company directly that those were the plans. The company had to learn from the media that those are the plans. And what does the CEO do? Of course, they come out with a statement that they are willing to work with the government to resolve this issue, but they will avail themselves of all legal channels available. And now you ask yourself, if you're in the shoes of the mining company, well, will I get a fair shake in that situation if I go to the local courts? You might, in some jurisdictions, yes, you might, but in other places you may not. You're going to sue a foreign government on its own turf in the local courts. So if you're in the shoes of the investor in that particular situation, you want to think about additional international protections, right? So my one key takeaway message, and I'm going to give it away now, is don't be parochial in your approach. Don't think that you always have to resolve everything at the local level. Yes, you have your local lawyers, you have your local your ear to the ground, but obviously think internationally as well. What are your international options? So in Hochschild's example, it's a UK company. There is a UK-Peru bilateral investment treaty which provides for international arbitration. Instead of going to the local Peruvian courts to challenge what the government might have done, you would go in front of an independent international tribunal and hopefully and certainly get due process, right? So this is just one example of how these types of treaties that I'm going to touch upon very briefly really can promote the rule of law. And really my message is, how can government and mining industry can work better together? It's through helping governments promote the rule of law. And I know it's a long and sometimes tedious process to do it through litigation, really, through arbitration, but it is a necessary evil in certain situations. I'll give you another practical example just to bring this point home. I was speaking to many of you here, I understand you're in the exploration stage of your businesses, and I love the optimism. I love the sheer self-confidence that everything is going to work out, and that's wonderful, because otherwise you're not going to close your deals if you're not optimistic and self-confident. But please, I implore you, you're always going to have political risk with mining, right? And even if you're at the exploration stage, I've had multiple clients who've spent, their good earned or fundraised money, right, only to then not be given a mining license or a mining lease, because then it's given to another investor who, the government prefers for whatever reason. So the message is clear: please always protect yourself. And how do you protect yourself if you are an investor? It is entirely within your power and control. Just structure your investment, okay? It's literally about structuring. It's how you hold the asset in country. So you're looking at your parent structure, your SPV or your ultimate parent, and make sure that the SPV you're using to hold that local asset in Peru, for instance, make sure it's held by a parent company which has a nationality, like the UK in this case, in the case of Hochschild, that has a sort of a treaty. That country of the parent or the SPV has a treaty with the underlying country, with Peru, Bolivia, whatever, just to make sure that you give yourself that option of enforcing your rights in international arbitration proceeding. You don't have to, you can do this at the time you acquire the investment, at the time you acquire the asset, but you're not too late to do it afterwards, right? You can still restructure to make sure, just like you restructure for tax reasons, you can restructure to make sure you take advantage of these treaty protections, as long as, and this is the key point, before the government conduct that you're going to, dispute has occurred or is foreseeable, right? So in the Hochschild example, if the government has come out publicly and said, I'm going to close your mine, that's too late. That's a ripe dispute. So, you're a bit too late to then be looking for the protection of these investment treaties. So that's why I cannot emphasize sufficiently that you should be doing this as a matter of due diligence. You should be doing an audit of your operations internationally in high-risk jurisdictions, just to make sure you have this protection if you need it. Why is this effective? I'm not telling you you bring a long arbitration, or you don't necessarily have to do this. Many governments take these cases seriously. They're high profile, they're public, particularly the ones that exist. So they're very likely, in my experience, not all governments, but about 30% of these cases settle early, right? So you have a very powerful leverage in your negotiations vis-a-vis the government. And I know I need to speak from the perspective of governments, if you would indulge me, Louise, literally for a minute. But there is a message for governments as well, and I know there's some government representatives in the audience as well. I used to represent governments in these proceedings. So it is tough for you because you're not a unitary. Everyone thinks of Peru or Bolivia. I keep picking on these countries. Everyone thinks of the government as a unitary structure. No, it is absolutely not. It is complex. It's a number of ministries, a number of agencies. There is the local, regional, federal government, and as a foreign investor, obviously, you've got to navigate all of these. And maybe you think you've got the right permit from one agency, but maybe you don't have it from another one. So as a government, I think your job in trying to work better with investors is to be transparent and explain your processes, give context to why you do what you do. Because very often you can take, again, going back to the Hochschild example, an isolated statement in the media or an isolated letter from the government, and then everybody is drawing the wrong conclusions. But as a government, you have got to give context. You have got to explain your internal processes that go behind a very important decision that you're making to close a mine or whatever. It's usually a multi-agency, a multi-ministry, a multiple review process, right? And make sure you keep good records, right? Because if you're going to get in a dispute, you've got to have to prove that actually what you were doing was really right. You were enforcing your own laws, etc., etc. And I think I'm probably out of time, but the key message, as I said, from me would be, please don't act parochial. Think about your international options because you just might need them. And I hope you don't, but I still have a job. So trust me, many of you have needed the services of people such as myself.
For sure, yes. Thank you. It's very enlightening. And I'm actually going to go to Louise next to build on that. So what happens and what can you learn from when something does go wrong? But after Louise, I'm going to come quickly to the audience for a question. Probably have time for one, maybe two if Andrew will allow me. So please be prepared if you have a question. But over to you, Louise. So when a transgression does happen, and I know you had a tailings incident last year. What does that do in terms of a shift of community and government relationships, and how do you get past that to get back to creating value?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no, thanks, Louise. Yeah, absolutely. We had an environmental incident last year at our Sasa mine in North Macedonia where our sustainability credentials and our local and national relationships were really tested, actually. So in terms of the actual incident itself, we had a leak from our tailings storage facility. On a global level, it was small, but to us, it was the worst thing that had happened to us in our 10 years of operation. So, our initial focus was obviously ascertaining the damage that we'd caused to the tailings dam and also to the river that some of the tailings had leaked into, and getting a plan together to repair the dam and to remediate the river as soon and as sensibly as possible, really. So in terms of what we actually did on the ground, we flew our COO and our sustainability director out to site. They were there within a couple of days, and we also flew out expert consultants as well who we wanted there to advise us all the way through the process as well. Our CEO also flew out shortly after, and he actually spent the best part of 3 months out there until the end of the year, really making sure that our local and government relationships were absolutely intact, and we'd sort of been there, been visible in country, frankly explaining ourselves to people. So that was the key thing. We actually repaired the tailings dam itself within 2 weeks. I think the incident was September, and it was repaired and operational again effectively in October. And by the end of December, we had removed 95% of the tailings which had spilt into the river. And by June this year, we'd removed effectively all the tailings. We can't ever say all of them, but 99%, let's say, of the tailings from the river. We'd taken the silt traps out and we sort of closed that process. So we've effectively drawn a line under it from that point. But what did we do to ensure that we handled a bad situation as well as possible? It really comes down to communication and the fact that, as Sylvia said, the key there is really having good relationships in the first place. We were fortunate. We had strong relationships locally and strong relationships with government going into this process that we could really, develop. So communication was absolutely key. Interestingly, from the investor perspective, which I'll just cover off very quickly, the incident actually happened 2 days before we were due to release our interim results, which you may think was terrible timing, but actually it put us in front of our investors 2 days after the incident on a roadshow we'd already arranged, actually explaining ourselves to all of them. So that actually turned out to be a positive thing. And I think in total we put 8 announcements out to the stock exchange in London from start to kind of closure of the process, explaining each stage of the way, the information, what had happened, the information that we'd found out, regular updates to keep people informed. And that was exactly what we did locally as well. So, a few days after the incident, we were in touch with local community leaders, the mayor and other important community members more than daily. There was regular meetings. We invited ministers and representatives from the Ministry of the Economy and the Environment to our site. We said, come and see what's happened. We'll explain everything that we have done. We had meetings with government, and our CEO actually had a meeting with the Prime Minister. And key to all of this was us putting our hands up and saying, this is entirely our responsibility. It has to be. It's our site. So I think that really helped as well with the messaging. And we did obviously have grievances, and we set ourselves a target really of attempting to sort of close those off by the end of the year. We more or less did that. I think we had 2 grievances left over from the end of last year, which were dealt with early on in this year, and there was no legal action involved in any of those cases. We wanted to deal with everything fairly, and as I say, admit our responsibility, etc. So I think there's also, when we got to the river remediation part of the process, which was a physical removal of the tailings from the river, we had big meetings with the community, with local people that lived nearby, to actually explain what was going to be happening, the machinery that we're going to use, where we were going to take that material in the river, move it away, etc. So that was all very well explained as well. And I think we spent, to sort of close off the situation effectively, we spent the bulk of the first half of this year building a recreational ground. Actually, we've cleaned up the river, and we've built a new park all the way along the river in the local town with playground, skateboard park, recreational areas, trails, walkways for the local people to enjoy as a sort of apology, effectively. And I think the feedback that we've had, from the investors, where we obviously get a lot of feedback, they felt like actually we've kind of, having done a lot of talking the talk, we'd actually walked the walk and demonstrated that, we put into action what we said we would do in event of a situation like this. So actually I think our credentials in the London market were possibly improved from this. And I think the same would go in North Macedonia. We've still got really strong government relationships. We've got really strong relationships in the local community, where we employ a lot of people as well. We've always been big supporters of the community and help to generally develop them and, support sustainable projects there for the long term. And, I think we probably can stand here and say that actually at the end of this awful incident, we've come out with strong relationships, arguably maybe even better because of the way that we dealt with it and the way that we made sure our communications were clear, open, honest, transparent with all of our stakeholders throughout what was a difficult situation.
Great. Thank you, Louise. I'm going to go quickly to the audience now, if that's okay. Just we've got one question, Andrew, if that's good. And sorry, I can't see behind that, so I'll stand up. Yes. Great.
This is a question for... Is that on? The question for Sylvia. If I've inherited companies which have been registered in the BVI...
I can't hear too well.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I've inherited companies that are registered in the BVI, although they're operational in Peru and other parts of Africa. Does that mean that the process with government reactions to something that goes wrong is much more difficult to sort?
Is it, if I understand the question correctly, if I might rephrase it just to make sure I understood it, is does BVI as a jurisdiction give you these protections potentially? It's a tough one, right? And here now you're testing my knowledge of the UK, territories, right? So I think BVI would fall in the same basket, I would say, as Jersey and Guernsey, I think the ones I've looked at more recently. But essentially, the way the UK treaties work in my experience is they don't extend to these territories automatically unless there is an exchange of notes between the UK government and, let's say, the country in Africa or wherever else, which expressly extends the coverage to these territories. So that's the difficulty, I think, sometimes for UK investors. You think because you're picking a tax efficient territory, within the UK, you're getting the UK's VAT protections, but generally not. So in your particular case, if you give me the list of countries, then I can specifically go and check whether there's this exchange of notes extending the coverage. But in my experience, it's been rare, right? Every time I've looked at a UK treaty, it's been rare that it's been extended to these territories. But it's a good question.
Thank you very much.
Another question? I have got time for one more, apparently, for Andrew. Yes, please. Right there in the blue sweater.
Hi, I'm Louise Porters, the Environment and Social Manager for Thor Explorations. One of the things that's been very important for our jurisdiction, we work a lot in West Africa, is there's more reliance on cultural governance than local governments. How do you handle that? Because it's a very important component for getting your project going and getting that social license to operate, which again is not a physical license. And I think for a lot of working in countries, jurisdictions that we do, that can sometimes be overlooked, and there's an emphasis put on the law when the communities have more respect for cultural governance than they do for often an imperial power law. And I'll put that across the board, or for the best answers, because I think it's hugely important for us to get a knowledge of this sort of governance, not just government.
Great, thank you, Louise, and Louise and I like your name. But so, who wants to take that first? Is it the culture? Because I think very important question. Yeah.
I can take that, and I think the lady is quite right, because in Africa, where sometimes there is a lot of disconnect between the local community and the central government, there is much less respect from what comes from the central government. Obviously, you still need to get the central government's permits, etc., that you require. But she's absolutely right that when you get to the local community, you need to identify the local leaders of the community. You need to reach an understanding with the local leaders of the community, because in a lot of cases, even the reach of the central government is very, very weak by the time you get to the local community. So it's a double-edged thing. You need the formal licenses, etc., that the central government gives, but you really need to reach an accommodation with the people that you are going to be working in their communities.
Yeah, well said. Anyone want to pile on? Or John?
Just to add, this is quite a common issue. You see this with indigenous communities, for example, in North America, Australia as well, South America. So I completely agree. You need to get your agreements with both the formal authorities and with communities, particularly if they're indigenous communities, because I think any respectable mining company ought to be respecting free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples as well. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. So I heard a lot. I think, to quote Taiwo to start, mining is not an island. You're operating, and to be successful, it's a very complex cultural and legal and government environment. And I think it's really important to have that sustainable mine plan, or that sustainable thing that looks more regionally, that doesn't think that the mining company has to do everything, but they have to do everything well, I think, as we learned from Louise. And fortunately, there's people like Sylvia to my left here to help if things don't go right. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I appreciate you coming to watch.
Thank you very much. Can we give them a warm round of applause, please? Thank you very much. Thank you.